2. Internal Ukrainian politics. The 2014 Maidan Revolution. The conflict moved from a diplomatic disagreement to a shooting war in 2014. The trigger? In late 2013, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, who was pro-Russian, backed out of a planned trade deal with the European Union (EU) in favor of a bailout from Russia. This sparked the Euro-Maidan protests, the revolution of dignity. After months of protests and violent crackdowns, Yanukovych fled to Russia and a pro-Western government took over. The Russian response. Russia labeled this transition a Western-backed coup. Following came a period of civil war in Ukraine and an increased hostility towards the Russian-speaking minority in Ukraine. Fearing that the Kyiv government would push out the Russian fleet from its naval base in Crimea in response, Russia annexed Crimea. On May 11-12, 2014, Ukraine's eastern Donbass region declared independence for the Donetsk People's Republic (DKR), and Russia started supporting pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, leading to a low-level war that lasted 8 years until the 2022 invasion. The conflict is essentially a collision between Russia's desire to maintain a sphere of influence over its neighbors and Ukraine's desire for sovereign self-determination and integration with Europe and security guarantees. Up until now, the weight of Russia's point of view has largely been dismissed by the so-called West, but a shift in atmospheric composition is on the horizon. As of late December 2025, the diplomatic landscape for ending the Russia-Ukraine conflict has shifted from abstract peace plans to active high-level negotiations. While a definitive end is not yet guaranteed, several realistic non-military off-ramps have emerged. The current diplomatic momentum is largely centered on a 20-point framework discussed between U.S. President Donald Trump, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and European leaders at Mar-a-Lago in late 2025. And yes, the West is finally also starting to talk to the Kremlin government. The most hopeful and realistic paths represent the most discussed objective endings that do not involve a total military victory for either side. 1. The security for land compromise. The most viable diplomatic path involves a frozen conflict where the front lines become a de facto border, similar to the North-South Korea model. Ukraine would pause its efforts to retake occupied territories like Crimea and parts of the Donbass by force. In exchange, it would receive ironclad security guarantees from the US and Europe, essentially an Article 5-style protection, without formal NATO. The mechanism? A demilitarized zone monitored by international observers or a peace council to prevent future incursions. 2. Manage sovereignty and neutrality. A key Russian red line has always been Ukraine's NATO membership. Ukraine might agree to a permanent neutrality clause in its constitution, meaning no NATO, but this would likely be paired with a NATO-like military partnership, where Ukraine maintains a massive standing army, currently discussed at 800,000 troops, to ensure Russia cannot easily invade again, basically a neutral with teeth. Russia might be forced to concede on Ukraine joining the European Union as a non-military compromise, providing Ukraine with long-term economic stability and the European political identity. Major remaining hurdles. To begin with, one of the main hurdles is the mere fact that neither the Ukraine, EU, NATO, or the US have been negotiating with the Russian Federation. All the peace talks and the point plans have simply been internal chats, judged by the fact that the Russian Federation has been absent from the negotiation table. Vladimir Putin has stated 4 main objectives with the special military operation. First, Ukraine must remain neutral and it must never enter NATO, ever. Second, Ukraine must be demilitarized. In the eyes of the Russian Federation, this means that Ukraine must only be allowed to maintain a military of the size around 20,000 troops. Third, denatification. All ultra-nationalistic elements must be eliminated from the Ukrainian government, and the nationalistic agenda that, according to Russia, has resulted in oppression of minorities like the Russian-speaking Ukrainians, banning of the Russian language and culture, must be abolished if the root cause to the conflict is to be addressed and peace to be accomplished. Fourth, Ukraine and the international community must recognize the four oblasts and the Crimea that the Russian Federation has annexed as Russian territories. The Russian justification being that a majority of the people living in these areas have voted to join the Russian Federation. We can add to these four objectives the legitimacy problem. Vladimir Putin has stated that Zelensky is not legally elected president of Ukraine. His term in office expired on May 20th, 2024, and only a newly elected president of Ukraine can legally sign a peace treaty. But let's assume that Ukraine and its backers and the Russian Federation will finally sit down at the negotiation table. There are still humongous obstacles that must be overcome. As of early 2026, three core objective challenges remain that could derail a settlement to the conflict from the Ukrainian side. The referendum requirements. President Zelensky has stated that any deal involving territorial concessions would likely require a national referendum. It is uncertain if the Ukrainian public, who have sacrificed heavily, would vote to accept such terms. The nationalist problem. Some analysts have suggested that Zelensky is trapped in the grasps of Ukrainian ultranationalists, like the Azov and the Banderas. They point out that in fact, Zelensky cannot concede to any of Russia's demands without risking his life. The bear problem. As noted by regional analysts, even if a deal is signed, the risk of a Minsk III, a ceasefire that Russia uses only to rearm and attack later, remains the primary fear for the West, something that is actually turned upside down by many Western analysts, since it has been acknowledged by the German and French leaders of the time of the original Minsk agreements, Angela Merkel of Germany and François Hollande of France, that it in reality was only a bluff intended to arm Ukraine to be able to fight off potential Russian invasion. At the time of this writing, the prospect of a peaceful settlement to the conflict is slim at best. We should be aware that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, clearly stated upon his arrival into the White House that he would not follow in the footsteps of his predecessor, who poured money and military equipment into Ukraine. However, Trump does apparently not want to be seen as the one who abandoned Ukraine, so he has shifted the burden to the Europeans, making it clear that the US will gladly provide Ukraine with weapons, but of course they will be paid for. And since Ukraine is totally unable to pay for pretty much anything, the bill will wind up at the Europeans, more specifically at the European Union's court. This coalesces with Trump's unnegotiable stance on getting the European nations in NATO to pay more for their own defenses and stopping the free ride. Looking forward, the main burden of the defense of Ukraine slams down to the Ukrainians actually fighting, and the EU, who will be financing the Ukrainian site. The US will of course be watching from the sideline, providing intelligence, and some sinister voices say will be making huge profits and enjoying seeing Europe down and the Russians struggle, with the malice hope of seeing the Russian Federation disintegrate and Vladimir Putin being ousted. So the peace deals might not ever have been anything but a smokescreen. As a matter of fact, as the cards are being played, it looks like the war will go on into an unforeseeable future. The Ukrainians and the Russians will keep dying, the military-industrial complex in the US will keep profiting, and the European taxpayers will have to pay an extra war tax for times to come. However, there might be a light at the end of this tunnel that might harbinger things to come, and just might put an end to this conflict faster than is apparent. For this, we must consider what is going on in the European Union at present, and consider if the democracy they have told us in the West we are defending is really worth defending at all.